by Shashi Tharoor, The Anxiety of Audience, an Indian writer in English, interrogates his craft. Moderator Prashant Jha. Thank you so much.
ललिनेस
किन चिया मिठो भएन?
फर्स्ट क्लास थियो नि साउनी।
अब यसरी नै प्रयोग गरेको पैसा पनि ब्याक पाउनुहोस्। एनसेल पैसा ब्याक अफर अन्तर्गत 1719 डायल गरी आफ्नो दैनिक प्रयोग गर्न तोकिएको रकम थाहा पाउनुहोस् अनि उक्त रकम मेन ब्यालेन्सबाट प्रयोग गरी पुरै पैसा बोनस ब्यालेन्स स्वरूप तुरुन्त फिर्ता पाउनुहोस्। एनसेल नेपालकै लागि।
ललिनेस
किन चिया मिठो भएन?
फर्स्ट क्लास थियो नि साउनी।
अब यसरी नै प्रयोग गरेको पैसा पनि ब्याक पाउनुहोस्। एनसेल पैसा ब्याक अफर अन्तर्गत 17119 डायल गरी आफ्नो दैनिक प्रयोग गर्न तोकिएको रकम थाहा पाउनुहोस्। अनि उक्त रकम मेन ब्यालेन्सबाट प्रयोग गरी पुरै पैसा बोनस ब्यालेन्स स्वरूप तुरुन्त फिर्ता पाउनुहोस्। एनसेल नेपालकै लागि।
ल लिनुहोस्।
किन चिया मिठो भएन?
फर्स्ट क्लास थियो नि साउनी।
अब यसरी नै प्रयोग गरेको पैसा पनि ब्याक पाउनुहोस्। एनसेल पैसा ब्याक अफर अन्तर्गत 17119 डायल गरी आफ्नो दैनिक प्रयोग गर्न तोकिएको रकम थाहा पाउनुहोस्। अनि उक्त रकम मेन ब्यालेन्सबाट प्रयोग गरी पुरै पैसा बोनस ब्यालेन्स स्वरूप तुरुन्त फिर्ता पाउनुहोस्। एनसेल नेपालकै लागि।
ल लिनुहोस्।
किन चिया मिठो भएन?
फर्स्ट क्लास थियो नि साउनी।
अब यसरी नै प्रयोग गरेको पैसा पनि ब्याक पाउनुहोस्। एनसेल पैसा ब्याक अफर अन्तर्गत 17119 डायल गरी आफ्नो दैनिक प्रयोग गर्न तोकिएको रकम थाहा पाउनुहोस्। अनि उक्त रकम मेन ब्यालेन्सबाट प्रयोग गरी पुरै पैसा बोनस ब्यालेन्स स्वरूप तुरुन्त फिर्ता पाउनुहोस्। एनसेल नेपालकै लागि।
पहिलो पोस्टको लाइभ स्ट्रिङमा छौँ हामी। अहिले शशि थरूर कार्यक्रम स्थलमा आइपुग्नु भएको छैन, त्यही भएर अहिले यो कार्यक्रम सुरु हुन सकेको छैन। यहाँ दर्शकहरू भरिसकिएको छ सबै कुर्सीहरू र यहाँ प्रतीक्षा हुँदैछ शशि थरूरको। तपाईँ हेर्दै हुनुहुन्छ पहिलो पोस्टबाट लाइभ स्ट्रिमिङ। अहिले शशि थरूरको कार्यक्रम एकैछिनमा सुरु हुन लागेको छ। हुन त यो कार्यक्रम 2 बजे सुरु हुने भनिएको थियो, तर शशि थरूर यहाँ कार्यक्रम स्थलमा आइ नपुग्नु भएकोले कार्यक्रम सुरु हुन अलि ढिला भएको छ। हेर्दै गर्नुहोस् पहिलो पोस्ट लाइभ स्ट्रिम। प्रज्ञा प्रतिष्ठानको यो ब्याकयार्डमा यो कार्यक्रम हुँदैछ र यो सिटहरू अहिले पुरै भरिसकिएको छ।
Yet again, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to invite on stage Mr. Shashi Tharoor, one of the India's leading minds and definitely among the nation's most eloquent public figures, and the moderator of this program, Mr. Sharma. Mr. Sharma, a political scientist, former advisor of late Prime Minister Girisha Prasad Koirala and President Ram Baran Yadav. Let us welcome them with a huge round of applause.
Namaskar, good afternoon. This is Hari Sharma, and today, the third day of Ncell Bookworm Literary Festival, we are delighted to have with us Shashi Tharoor, officially Honorable Shashi Tharoor. He is a member of Parliament. He represents the Thiruvananthapuram constituency from Kerala twice to the Indian Parliament. And as you've been reading today, a day before yesterday also, about Shashi and his credentials. He served as a long time as a UN high-level diplomat or UN civil servant, as Under Secretary, if I'm correct, to the UN, and he was also India's nomination for the Secretary General post. More than that, Shashi is a prolific writer and commentator on contemporary issues. He has written extensively, and as I was reading the interview published recently in one of the Nepali magazine, he has dozen-plus books to his credit. And strangely, I picked up his book long back, 1983, if I remember the date correctly, January in Delhi, when I was visiting my professor Bhavani Sen Gupta, and asking him which book I should read on Indian foreign policy. And Shashi's book has just published a year before, Region of the State, published by Vikas. And before that, I've been reading him very interesting magazine edited by Anil Darkar in Debonair. Tilottama Tharoor used to write there.
No, we didn't write for Debonair. It was a magazine called Gentleman, not Anil Darkar, Minhas Merchant.
Yeah. So
yes,
and he has been writing in the newspaper from early on.
Debonair had nudes, Gentleman didn't. That was a big difference.
Yeah. And there was a lot of, and as you must have in the conference or literary festivals, magazine published, which gives a lot of insight into Shashi's career, his reading interest, his work, the journey which began with the formally region of the state, and then he entered into the world of fiction through the great Indian novel, which is a very interesting Mahabharata is a very interesting epic for many of us. Not only interesting, but there are many Mahabharats. And Indian literary tradition is greatly informed by the characters, the plots, and the scope of Mahabharata. And the great many Indian writers have used Mahabharata as to understand not only the past Indian society, but contemporary Indian societies. They have fictionalized the characters, and reading great Indian novel is a very interesting way to look into the post-colonial situation in India. And his journey towards the fiction very interestingly ended with, I haven't seen the book on fiction after the riot. He published short stories, $5, the title is $5 something, it's smart. And the other book is on Bollywood, which is again fiction. There are 3 fictions which are very interesting. But in terms of non-fiction, his commentaries were published in a book form, most interestingly, Midnight to Millennium, which chronicles the Shashi's views on contemporary development in Indian politics, society, and global. And recently, the Pax Indica is also very interesting work which talks about India's role, especially after 1990 when globalization ushered a new way of looking at politics and societies. So Pax Indica revisits some of his own writings. For example, there is a chapter on what were different when he wrote The Region of State, and later he became the Minister of State for External. So it's a very interesting. Shashi has been constant commentator. He is a very active in social media, Twitter, Facebook. So it's a pleasure to have you in Kathmandu. And I know this is your first visit to Kathmandu. Welcome to Kathmandu. Welcome to Nepal. And I heard and we saw in your Twitter, when I've been following you for some time, you did go to mountain flights and you went to Patan. So you're already into understanding how Nepali geography, society. So this would be an opportunity to interact with you and learn from you. And one of the most other thing is that recently the Penguin has reissued the 25th year of his book, The Great Indian Novel, which is just published this week, republished this week.
Fresh copy. Just came off the press yesterday.
So, congratulations on 25th years of the Great Indian Novel.
Thank you.
Let us begin our conversation.
Thank you. First of all, thank you for all the very kind words, and great to see such a large audience on a working day. I didn't realize when I accepted this invitation that Sunday is a working day in Nepal, but I'm delighted that so many of you have nonetheless managed to come, and it's wonderful to have an opportunity to celebrate the power of the word with the book lovers of Kathmandu. Yes, as Hari was saying, this book, I brought along a copy out of sheer pride because it's literally fresh off the press. It was delivered to me at the airport yesterday in Delhi, and it's being released in Delhi only on the 23rd. So you're seeing the first copy that has been publicly shown anywhere of the Silver Jubilee edition of the Great Indian Novel. And I must say that when I published it 25 years ago, little would I have imagined that it would still be around, still being read by new generations, and 43 reprints later they've gone and done this 25th anniversary edition.
The organizers have given this conversation writer as a politician. As if we look into since you geographically and culturally belong to India, let me refer to our own Indian experience. The politicians in India often they write in a great speed, length. For example, Pandit Nehru wrote wonderful treatise on India, Discovery of India, which is a fantastic book to his understanding of India. And when Ram Guha recently published The Makers of Modern India, where he picked up or selected the writings of Indian politicians, these writings were kind of imaginations or the kind of India they wanted during the freedom struggle. So there's a lot of writings have imaginations, writings have programs. As a politicians, they wanted to see the society the way they wanted to see it or craft. So I think the politicians and writers, especially if you look into the ancient political theory, there's a relationship between rhetoric and politics, because earlier literature was known as a rhetoric. Therefore, politics is always associated with the rhetoric, how you wanted to present yourself, what are your opinions, and politics is also about conversation, ideas. This is very ideas. So the earlier politicians were writing for their programs, but you were a writer first and then politician later on. So how do you see that?
Well, that's a fair question, because when you mention Nehru, who is the great example of a literary politician in India, except he never wrote fiction, he wrote amazingly well, and he did so almost entirely in prison. If you look at it, Nehru's output, which was formidable, most of it was written in British jails, having been arrested for his work as a nationalist politician. And then he would write, often without notes or reference material available to him. But he's written an amazingly broad-minded sweep of global history, glimpses of world history. He has written an autobiography. He's written a book called The Discovery of India, which explores the entire history of India from his perspective. Remarkable, remarkable work, an amazing mind. And after he was free of the threat of British imprisonment, his literary output dwindled. All we have from him is speeches and letters. We don't have books anymore.
His 5-volume letters to the Chief Minister is excellent work of statecraft.
That's right.
And for example, Dr. Pandit Nehru travels to Pathankot to inaugurate some, the indigenous people's, festival. And then he writes to the, all the Chief Ministers at that time. Some of the chief ministers were referred as a prime ministers because there was still changes were coming in, and he describes beautifully why the chief minister or prime minister in the South India need to understand. He was connecting, and I could see a connectedness of imagination of India, which you also wrote a small book on a Nehru called Invention.
Nehru, the Invention of India. Yeah.
So I think the politicians, as a writer, to me, is an imaginative writer. So it's a work of fiction at the same time, it's
a work of creativity, but not of fiction, because fiction has to be completely a work of the imagination. But Nehru was extremely creative, and he had literary flair. Even his own will is really so beautifully written, it could have been written by an accomplished novelist. I mean, the description of the Ganga River and what it means to him and why he wants his ashes to be immersed partly there is an amazing work of literary writing. So there is an amazing quality there to his writing. But all the political writers in India, you're right, are first politicians and only secondarily writers, and much of their writing has been to serve their politics. Whereas you're right that in my case, it went the other way. I wasn't in politics till 6 years ago, 5.5 years ago. And having been somebody who had written and published a dozen books before getting into the political arena, a lot of people thought that that would be the end of my output. I have been writing since, but I've been writing much more material that's related to my political preoccupations. And that tends to be unavoidable, because what happens very often is that when you want to write, in any case, anything, you need time, and time is scarce for a politician, particularly an elected politician who has constituents making demands on him. But then there is also the challenge that with fiction, you need not only time, but to create a space inside your head, to invent an alternative world, an alternative universe, populated with characters, episodes, dialogue, incidents, which should be as real to you while you're composing it as the world in which you're living and functioning. Now that's possible if you can keep the two worlds fairly clearly apart, and where the other world doesn't intrude on the first when you are immersed in the first. But it seems to me that the impossibility of writing good fiction or good literary fiction for a politician, as it indeed became the case towards the latter part of my UN career as well, is that when even your evenings and weekends are not sacrosanct, when anytime you sit down to re-enter that illusory world, the illusion can be shattered at any moment by the ring of the bell or the ring of the telephone that you can't afford to ignore, then the composition of fiction becomes truly difficult. And so I have my last 15 years have been littered with novels of, I think, considerable promise, which I had to abandon, because when you have interruptions too much, the illusion gets shattered and it cannot be rebuilt again. So I have at least 4 begun novels which I'm afraid are sort of unsuccessful, incomplete and abandoned. But I've been in the meantime producing columns, essays and non-fiction books. I'm quite proud of the one you mentioned, Pax Indica, which is my second book on foreign policy. The first one you bought more than 30 years ago. But this one is a book which, oh my gosh, I'm very touched. Yes, that is the one book of mine that is out of print. So hold on to the copy, because I'm told that on Amazon you can only get it for $40, and I think it was originally published for under $5. So being out of print can be an advantage to the owner of the book. If you need $40 in a hurry, that's you can auction it on Amazon or eBay. But the fact is that Pax Indica was an attempt to, as you said, to reflect on India in the present era. And I have another book that I'm working on now, which will be a collection of my writings in the last decade or so on various aspects of contemporary India. So that still keeps me engaged with writing and with politics.
Okay. And you have already written on Pax Indica about the region of state when you wrote that book as a PhD dissertation at the age of 21. And then you were in Delhi for research of that book, and I was amazed by the kind of resources or kind of reference that you used. And very interestingly, you've been able to interview 4 foreign minister and Mrs. Gandhi herself. The book is the region of the state. His first book talks about the very important time of India's political history, 1966 to 1977. This is also a period of Mrs. Gandhi's consultation, Bangladesh war and various issues. And I was, when I read that book at that time, in 80s, there were very few books on India's foreign policy establishment, how decisions are made, what kind of relationship the political leadership or bureaucracy, what goes into the making of Indian foreign policy in terms of, because of parliamentary democracy, Nehru was a very leader with very much of height, his global influence, so there was not much question. But when Mrs. Gandhi became the Prime Minister, and as we know, the foreign policies are always a prerogative of Prime Minister, although they are charismatic foreign ministers, but foreign policy is always a prerogative of the Prime Minister. But you have brought out a very interestingly the dynamics. At the same time, you have mentioned the Indian foreign policy, basically bureaucracy or IFS, capacity issues, resources, and you became Minister of State afterwards. And in Pax Indica, you revisit some of the work that you've done in the region of state, and stand by some of the the analysis after 30 years. So to our audience, could you explain what it to be a researcher, independent, free-minded, and suddenly on a driving seat of an institution which you have studied and critiqued so beautifully?
Yes, that was an unusual situation, though I would not say it was a unique one. I mean, right now the Polish foreign minister is somebody who had been a columnist in exile during the years of communism and was writing from the Radek Stepanek. And he, no, not Stepanek, that's a tennis player, Radek Sikorsky. And he is now foreign minister. So there are others who've had this kind of unusual experience. I wasn't in exile, of course, but I was a critic, and my book, my first book, was written just after the emergency, when Mrs. Gandhi had lost the election of '77.
The emergency also informs you this is the
yes, very much.
The name of Mrs. Gandhi is tweaked into Duryodhani Priyadarshini. Very interesting.
Yes. Well, the thing is that the emergency was a seminal event for many of us at that time. I happened to be of an age when a major event at that time would have a profound impact. And I think it forced many of us to rethink our fundamental assumptions about India, about democracy, about the nature and values of our society and where we were going. And therefore it had a profound and lasting impression on the minds of many people of my generation. So yes, the emergency does play a large role in a lot of my early writing. And in this novel, the Great Indian Novel, by the way, is not a title that reflects my estimate of its contents. it is actually a reference to the Mahabharata. It's actually Maha is great and Bharata is India. So the great Indian novel is an allusion to the epic, which I have tried to reinvent as a satirical tale of 20th century India, our nationalist movement, our politics, and so on. Now, the fact is that the great Indian novel came out about a dozen years after the end of the emergency, but the novel, in trying to satirically develop and describe the evolution of India from the days of the nationalist movement to the aftermath of the emergency, naturally that had to influence a lot of the choice of characters and events. Now, looking back on it 25 years later, in some ways I'm still thrilled by what I found myself able to write at that time. But obviously some of the political judgments will have to change and have changed in my own mind in the years since then. But the novel has to be seen and judged as a novel and not as a political statement, whereas the books of non-fiction are forthright expressions of opinion. There's no satire involved in analyzing or critiquing Indian foreign policy, and there I do have to stand by every opinion that I've expressed.
And your second novel, The Show Business, talks about the very interesting way that the Bollywood symbolizes the Indian society, the kind of myth making that goes into it. The character, the Ashok, is a very interesting character, and through that novel you talk about the corruptions, manipulations, again the various components that perfectly fits with the politics also. So and then when you come to third novel of yours, The Riot, is a very interesting in terms of writing and style plus presentation. This novel I find a very innovative in a sense that news reporters, there are the plots after plots, the conversations, and there's one conversation that I find very interesting, the Lakshman to Priscilla Hart. I'm an administrator, not a political scientist, but I had say there are 5 major sources of divisions in India: language, region, caste, class, and religion. And when I looked into your Millennium to Midnight to Millennium book, you constantly come to some of these fundamental questions that the Indian society confronts. So I see a blur line between, you've been thinking about all these issues which divides, according to this particular the character speak in Riot, and then you reflect very beautifully in your book on Midnight to Millennium, search for India's unity, search for India's uniqueness. And there's a very interesting phrase that you mentioned of the thali metaphor. We have been hearing a lot about unite from the US metaphor, that this the melting pot, and of late that metaphor has been converted into salad ball. And you use a very interesting metaphor of salad, the thali. I think in your fiction also, you've been constantly thinking about the kind of society you want. So it's a very interesting. If we read your writing in totality, I think they find some consistencies in terms of preoccupations, literary preoccupations.
Very much.
Now you're very much in politics, and the recent elections have also brought forth many of these questions. Caste, religion, region. So how do you reflect on that?
Well, the thali metaphor, for those who are not familiar with what Hari is quoting, is that India is not a melting pot, but a thali. It is a collection of different bowls, each of which contains a different dish that doesn't therefore flow into the next because it is in separate bowls. But they belong together on the same platter, and they contribute together on your palate to giving you a satisfying repast. And that is my idea of India, because there are very, very genuine distinctions and differences, ethnic, religious, and so on, amongst people of different states, different backgrounds. But the idea is that they all stay together under the same political space and dream the same national dreams. And this is the magic, in some ways, of what Indian democracy has been able to accomplish. to bring together a disparate collection of people with only some elements in common, but create through the carapace of an overarching Indian identity, people who can be secure in multiple identities. In a sense, India is where the European Union hopes to be in 100 years, except they're not there yet, and they won't be there for a long time. India has been able to accomplish that. Now there are these divisions, and therefore these differences you mentioned are very much there. We have differences of caste, of creed, of color, of culture, of cuisine, of custom and costume, and indeed of conviction. But we still manage to rally around a consensus. And that consensus is on the very simple democratic principle that in a large, rich, diverse country like ours, you don't really need to agree all the time, so long as you will agree on the ground rules of how you can disagree. I think that's what democracy teaches you. We disagree, we argue, we contest elections, some of us lose, some of us win, and the nation goes on. And this ultimately has been the great strength that has sustained independent India. If you go back to the early decades of independence, you will find lots and lots of wise pundits and polemical journalists saying that this is the last election in India, democracy cannot be sustained in a country like this, and so on. But they got it completely wrong. Not only could democracy be sustained, it was democracy that sustained the country.
Yeah, the very famous Sally Garrison's statement.
The dangerous decade.
Dangerous
the
decade.
Neville Maxwell, covering the 1967 elections for the London Times, said this was the last election. I mean, this kind of talk. And they were all wrong. And in their wrongness, we get a clue to what is right about India.
So you served for many years in international United Nations in a very important positions. Even then you've been writing quite often, but you wrote basically essays in the syndicated articles. The working in an international arena must have made you to think what India's position in the world, or it was there as a student of international relations earlier?
Well, I obviously thought about it throughout my student days and my thesis.
Have you ever thought that you would be contesting at a Secretary General's position?
No, but that was that really came up in the last few months. In fact, I was nominated rather late in the game. The other candidates were all largely in the fray for several months before I was nominated. There were 7 candidates in the race, and by the time I entered, I think I was the 5th one to enter the lists. But in the end, I did well enough, because when the balloting started, I came second and only 2 votes behind Ban Ki-moon. But by the time we got to the 4th ballot, when the identity of the voters was revealed, that is, the permanent members had different ballot paper from the non-permanent, it was very clear that the vote margin was not important. It was that I had a permanent member voting against me, and Mr. Ban did not. And since ultimately that implied a veto, I decided to pull the plug. That's what happened there. But the experience of serving the United Nations should not be judged only by that one election, because I had 29 wonderful years, very satisfying, very rewarding, working for refugees for the first 11 of them.
You were posted in Singapore.
Yes, I headed the operation in Singapore at the peak of the Vietnamese boat people crisis, when refugees were being rescued at sea and brought into the port. We ran the camp, we organized a resettlement. Amazing, a small, young, energetic team that was able to change lives. I mean, for me, my refugee work meant that I could put my head to the pillow every night, knowing the things I'd said and done during the day had actually made a difference to human beings' lives. And these are real human beings I could see and meet and talk to, not just figures on a piece of paper. So that was the amazing satisfaction. Then I ended up in peacekeeping at the end of the Cold War, when it was growing dramatically. And I was very much involved in the expansion and development of peacekeeping at that time. I wrote about it, spoke about it, and on top of that I was in charge of what became the largest operation, Yugoslavia, during the Civil War and after. And so that again was an amazing opportunity to leave your smudgy thumbprints on the footnotes of the pages of history. Except that, of course, unlike the refugee satisfaction where you were able to influence solutions and changing lives, in this kind of work you very often spent 18-hour days with the frustration that the blood was still flowing. But we still made, I think, a decent difference. And then finally working in the other areas of the Secretary General's office, working closely with that remarkable individual Kofi Annan, and finally running my own department to the UN, being able to demonstrate competence at management, administration, budgeting, reform, all of those things. That gave me a very, very well-rounded UN career that I can look back on with a lot of satisfaction. And
so
I do.
Are you planning to write something on your UN experience?
I don't know, not yet, Hari. I mean, first of all, I suppose I'm now free to do so. Yeah. Whereas whenever people ask me if I write about politics or my political life, I tend to say no, because I don't think you should do that when you're in it. I think that the detachment that is required in good writing can only come when you have subtracted yourself from that world.
Do politicians retire in our continent?
That's a very fair question. Very fair question, because in India no one does. But there is enforced retirement. I have to always say that the voters might return me to the world of literature. But coming back to your earlier thought, no, I've not written about the UN. Actually, one of the novels I began was set in the UN world and never finished. But non-fiction, I don't know. I might save it for a memoir one day, but then I really will have to retire.
Memoir has become quite popular in Nepal. Everybody is writing memoirs, especially not politicians, but the bureaucrats, civil servant, and various people. Let's talk a little bit on the, again, literature. You know, Bookless in Baghdad is your collection of essays where you talk about your readings, about writers, and it's a very interesting anecdotes there of your childhood. You know, you writing ferociously. You know, even the recent interview which was published here in Kathmandu informs us that as a child you promised, or you made that point, that you will read one book a day. And again,
for one crazy year, that's all.
One crazy year, and then again you said that, you know, you don't have to force time in the reading. You know, reading has to be pleasure.
Exactly.
Reading has to be reflective.
That was what was wrong with that target, I said.
So, what kind of book you read that crazy year? If I missed
well, first of all, I read very rapidly. So, and I finished my homework quite quickly. So I came back from school and read all evening. I also was not a terribly healthy child, so I wasn't outdoors playing a lot. So reading and writing were my principal extracurricular activities after school. And so that's why, I mean, obviously I read some short books. And when I said it was not a book a day, it was 365 books in the year.
Okay.
So there were some days on a Sunday or a Saturday when I might finish 2 or 3 short books. And there'd be some days when a long book might take me several days. So, so it varied, but I read everything. I read indiscriminately, and to some degree, I think that is something I would recommend to parents here. If you find your child is reading things that you don't entirely approve of, I would say encourage her to do so, because ultimately, she will develop through wide reading a sense of discernment as to what is worth reading. So I read the classics. I read Dickens. I enjoyed Dickens. I read Twain. I mean, I was the year I did this, I was barely 12 years old. But I was able to read those classics. But I also read, you know, popular fiction, thrillers, James Hadley Chase, whatever. And no one in my home said to me, "Don't read this, only read that." Because that, I think, is a recipe to get the child to hate the that you want them to read, and desire the this that you don't let them read. Best thing, let them read anything. After a while, when they see the difference between one kind of writing and another, they will find their own level as readers. So in my case, I read all sorts of stuff. I kept a list. I finished the 365 by Christmas, and then I said, I'm never going to do this again, because it took a lot of the pleasure out of reading to be reading to a deadline.
Okay. So have you written any literary criticism or something like that?
Well, Bookless in Baghdad contains a lot of essays on reading and writing, some of which would not qualify as literary criticism, but more about writing than literary criticism in the classic sense. I have, however, done a fair bit of book reviews. I'm often asked by publications to review books, and I've never collected those, largely because people feel that, you know, book review is a book review. You know, either the book is no longer of interest to many people, or it's just a work of history. But when I was in America, I reviewed books regularly for the Washington Post and the New York Times. And I've done occasional reviews for the Financial Times, for the Indian press all over the place. And if I were to sit down and collect my reviews as a work of literary criticism, I would probably get to very close to 100 books that I have reviewed in various places. Most recently, as a politician, an Indian magazine asked me to review Hillary Clinton's recent memoir. So, you know, the reviewing doesn't stop, and therefore the reading doesn't stop either.
Okay. And you've been a prolific writer since the beginning, and plus now politicians. what are the similarities or differences of a life of a writer and life of a politician?
Probably none. I mean, to be very blunt, because writing, in my view, is fundamentally a solitary activity. It's wonderful to be able to connect to you all as readers, but ultimately what a writer does is to be alone with his or her own thoughts and words on a piece of paper or a computer keyboard, and ideally with no one around to distract them even with their breathing. Then you enter the world in which you are engaged as a writer, and all that matters is you and the word. A politician is the exact opposite. A politician must be constantly engaged with people, because it's from people that he derives his own legitimacy, his own validity in his profession, and a politician must therefore be infinitely interruptible and distractible. A politician is almost never alone with his thoughts, which is one of the reasons why we have so many politicians and so few statesmen, because politicians in all democracies, not just India or Nepal, do not have the time to actually think long term. It's a miracle if they can think beyond the next election. And therefore everything is about immediate results. The immediate, the urgent always transcends the important in the long term. So writers must have a vision. Politicians ideally ought to have a vision, but very rarely do. Writers must have solitude. Politicians simply can't afford solitude. A politician who's alone is a failed politician, or a politician heading for failure. A writer must enjoy the magic of the word, the use of the word to produce certain results. A politician often uses words to conceal, to disguise, to obfuscate, because a politician can't afford to be too explicit. So in almost every area there is nothing in common between writers and politicians, except that they are both reacting to and relating to the world they see around them. And what I say about myself as both a writer and a politician is, to me, these are two different ways of reacting to the world in which I happen to be living and which I care about.
No, you're very active on the social media. So you use your social media for your political purpose or your creativity, writing purpose?
Everything. Today I used it to benefit Nepal tourism. I hope they'll give me due recognition, because I put out a dozen tweets today about my visit to Basantpur and Patan. And of course, earlier, as Hari was mentioning, I took the Everest Experience flight, which is an amazing thing, and tweeted some pictures from there. And these have all been repeated and retweeted and favorited from lots of people. So I certainly hope that Nepal tourism will see a spike, at least, of people from India coming as a result. But yes, I do use it for politics. I put across my political messaging very strongly through social media. I use it occasionally to talk about my family and myself. I use it to share things of interest to me. If you write an interesting article and I happen to see it, I'll just retweet the article or draw people's attention to it. And it may not be on anything that I'm working. It could be an article on cricket, could be an article on Nepal. Whatever.
You've also written on the cricket.
Yes, I love, it's a game I'm passionate about. As a child, however, I always wanted to play cricket very badly. And that's exactly what I did. I played cricket very badly. So I could only follow it and write it. Could no longer play it, but I have been reading and writing and watching.
So, I was, while listening to you on use of social media for various purposes, how do you see the literature or the art of writing or the producing literature in the age of digital media?
Well, I think it's a challenge in the sense that there are two kinds of challenges. The first is, of course, that digital media creates people with shorter and shorter attention spans. I mean, Twitter to some degree is an embodiment of the fact that people have short attention spans, because you can only use 140 characters. Everything you want to say has to be said in such brevity that you can no longer have room for nuance. For if the ideal word is too long, you'll use the less ideal word to fit into the space. So all of this means that you really are catering to a different sort of sensibility. The second challenge is that it adds to the multiple options available that readers didn't have in my time. And I was a child, I was an asthmatic child, often confined to bed, wheezing, needing distractions. But there's no television in the Bombay of my boyhood. There were no computers, and no computers at homes anyway. Nintendo wasn't even a gleam in an inventor's eye. I mean, there was literally nothing you could do, and especially if you were alone, so you couldn't play cards with somebody or whatever. You had to read.
And so I became an inveterate reader, partly also because of the absence of alternative possibilities to spend my time. Today, a child in my situation would probably not want to make the effort to read. They would just want to lie up propped on a pillow and watch his favorite cartoons on the screen, on the television screen. And that, I think, is a challenge. And now, that same child, if he's well enough or she's well enough to sit in front of a computer or has a handheld smartphone with social media on it, can spend the entire time on social media, surfing the net, reading various things that catch their fancy, communicating with strangers, expressing outrageous opinions, insulting and being insulted, all the things that you do on social media. And that can be sometimes marvelously entertaining, and you don't actually miss not being able to read Charles Dickens in the original. Now, you know, there will be some who would argue, so what's wrong? The world is evolving. There was a time when what needed to occupy your mind was literature. Today, literature has got to compete for space with 10 other things. And that's the way, that is the world we're in. So let literature fight for its space amongst those 10 things.
Dear friends, tomorrow Shashi will be speaking the closing note address, The Anxiety of Audience. An Indian writer in English integrate its craft. So I won't be asking you to share with us what you're going to speak tomorrow, but that will be reserved for tomorrow. But what does it mean by the anxiety of audience? Or is something...
Well, it's a reference to the accusation that many Indian writers, and I suppose Nepalese writers in English, have faced, that that because we're writing in quote-unquote a foreign language, we're not really writing for our own people, or we're not authentic, we're catering to foreign tastes. But let me leave the answer to that charge to my lecture tomorrow. It's at, what time is it, 11:30. 11:30 tomorrow, and I look forward to seeing which of you would be interested in hearing that.
A little bit to tweak that tomorrow's presentation. What is the anxiety of the Indian voters, or the voters at large? Recent your article on democracy, Project Syndicate article, which was circulated all over, talks about democracies and its challenge. So how does the anxiety of the voters, citizens, democracy all over the world are facing some sort of crisis? Because people are using all kinds of extra democratic methods to unleash the government. We saw that in the various parts of the globe around. So democracy has been inherently tied up with the idea of a delivery. People are talking about delivery. So just to tweak, the anxiety of the voters.
Now, I think that's a very fair question, Harry, and you're a presidential advisor, so you had to deal with that yourself. I mean, I feel that voters everywhere basically want the same things. They want a better life for themselves and their families. And how you define a better life and who you trust to get you that better life is ultimately what influences your vote. I don't think it's more complicated than that. Now, how do you define a better life? That's where you start getting complicated, because different interest groups will define interests, outcomes and policies differently. And so obviously you appeal to different people from different points of view. Everyone has their own vested interests, their own target needs, their own desires, and they will try to push that in order to sell their vote, as it were, to politicians. Politicians sometimes have their own convictions and try and crusade for those convictions with the voters. Many other politicians try and figure out what the voters want them to say, and then go and pander to them by campaigning on issues which they believe will get them the voters' support, not because they actually have any passionate feelings themselves on these matters. My late father said to me 50 years ago, in India we're not only the world's largest democracy, we're the world's largest hypocrisy. And that too may well be true, because we have a lot of politicians and others who are saying and doing things they don't really believe, but which they believe will get them votes. And that's a form of hypocrisy that's deeply entrenched in many democracies. And as I said, the voters' desire to have an improvement in their life is so fundamental that they're getting more and more impatient now, which is again wonderful. The impatience of an increasingly young Indian population is going to be that much more than that of the older generations of Indian voters, who were more resigned to taking time, more resigned to taking the time required. I think we have an important conversation going on here. Sorry, I can't hear the... Thank you very much. Appreciate it. So important conversations can always be conducted outside, and the rest of us can talk. But coming back to what the voters want, I think that's essentially what it comes down to. Now, sometimes they think a particular party embodies that. Sometimes they think a particular individual embodies what they're looking for, and voter behavior is only predicted after the votes are cast. I am not a great believer in the art of psephology, because I find that most election predictions have been wrong in most democracies, including mine. Okay, polling in smaller societies is easier to do because scientific elements of random sampling can work in more homogeneous societies and more coherent voter pools. But in a country like India, with the astonishing diversities we have, no polling organization has yet predicted an election entirely accurately. Even those who said that Mr. Modi and the BJP would win this last election, no one predicted such an astonishingly overwhelming result in his favor. So the fact is that at the end of the day, we look back after an election and figure out what the voters wanted.
As a politicians, we wish you have a long life as a politician, but there is a dilemma. We want you to write prolifically, produce nice novels and nice commentaries. So I see a dilemma there. We want you to retire from politics and write, or...
so do my opponents, though. That's the only problem.
Or you also keep on writing and informing the public. It was we began a little late, so we have to end a little early because we have a next session coming in. So it was nice talking to you, and thank you very much for this wonderful conversation.
Thank you, Harry. Thank you all for being here. See you tomorrow, some of you at least. Thanks.
Loneliness.
किन चिया मिठो भएन?
फर्स्ट क्लास थियो नि साउनी.
अब यसरी नै प्रयोग गरेको पैसा पनि ब्याक पाउनुहोस्. Ncell पैसा ब्याक अफर अन्तर्गत 1711 डायल गरी आफ्नो दैनिक प्रयोग गर्न तोकिएको रकम थाहा पाउनुहोस्. अनि उक्त रकम मेन ब्यालेन्सबाट प्रयोग गरी पुरै पैसा बोनस ब्यालेन्स स्वरूप तुरुन्त फिर्ता पाउनुहोस्. Ncell नेपालकै लागि.
ज्यू यहाँ उपस्थित हुनुहुन्छ. त्यसैगरी प्रस्तोताका रूपमा युवा समीक्षक गुरुङ सुशान्त ज्यू हामी माझ हुनुहुन्छ. आउनुहोस् उहाँहरूलाई यस मञ्चमा स्वागत गरौँ.